Welcome to A Gentleman's Review, bringing you the news that the mainstream propaganda does not. I'm Art Hampton, I'm your host, and today with me is Joe Wolverton. He is a director for the John Birch Society and has a J.D. Doctorate of Jurisprudence Law. And today we're going to be talking a little bit about the founder's recipe or founder's blueprint for America. So tell us a little bit about yourself and a little bit about the founders.
Okay. Well, I'm, like Arthur said, I'm Joe Wolverton, and I'm the constitutional law scholar for the John Birch Society and director of publications and the president of Western Islands, which is the publishing arm of the John Birch Society. The books we publish are published under that imprint, Western Islands. And before that, I was an attorney, mainly handling Fourth Amendment cases in Tennessee. And gosh, I've done everything. I've taught law school. I've been a college professor, high school teacher, and been employed full-time by the John Birch Society. It's about a year and a half now, and concentrating originally on making sure that everything the John Birch Society publishes about the Constitution is correct historically, legally, constitutionally. And I'm from Memphis originally and still live just outside of Memphis and travel a lot nowadays, giving speeches about some of the books I've written, some of the missions that the John Birch Society has adopted that I created, and trying to help people understand more about our history, and within that vein, make them better defenders of the Constitution, and then have them also how to get involved in politics in a way that's meaningful, right? And ultimately with the goal of, I guess, protecting, preserving, restoring the Constitution and the liberties that it was designed to protect, and giving people the resources they need to become more active, zealous defenders of the truth. And I know some people feel intimidated by that, so I take it as my job is to clear that up, help people feel more capable, feel more at ease, and then to entertain a little bit when it comes to sharing with them the books and authors most often quoted by our founding fathers, and to explain, well, I had not explained so much as just reveal is a better word, reveal the fact that when the Marxists took over education in the United States in the late 1880s and on through the early 20th century, they purposefully erased these important books from our national curriculum. And my job is to restore those books back to their prominence, the prominence that they had when our founding fathers were young and going to school, and then when they were older. The idea being, if we can read what our founders read, we will do what our founders did, and that is to throw off the chains of tyranny, restore liberty to this country. And I reckon we can do that in a more effective way if, instead of just knowing what is in the Constitution, knowing why it's there, where it came from, so we understand it a bit better, making yourself a leader, because so many people can barely tell you what is in the Constitution, much less quote you chapter and verse of where it came from. And so that's what I do now is I go around. That's a trip to Georgia and South Carolina. We're scheduled to teach people about the founder's recipe. What is it that they read? And the fact that you look at these things and you realize, first of all, you realize why the educrats erased it from the curriculum. You instantly realize when you read some of the things these people say, why the Rockefellers, right? Why, Horace Mann, why John Dewey, why they said we cannot have American kids reading these books, right? Because if you teach them these things, they'll likely grow up like their ancestors and reject tyranny in all its forms. And so if we can have them read, Dick has a ball, Dick's friend is Jane, Jane has a dog. Get them to read that rubbish and stop them from reading other books then we can control them. And as Rockefeller said, he wanted to create a country of workers, not a country of thinkers. And he's been pretty successful.
Indeed. So tell us a few of these people that who the founders looked at. I think number one, I think that would be the Bible, would it not?
Number one is 100%. 100%. The Bible, St. Paul is the most often quoted person by the founding generation. They would quote 2 Corinthians with regard to where the Spirit of the Lord, there's a spirit of freedom, and they would quote from Galatians 4:31, stand fast wherewith in the freedom that the Lord has made you free. They quoted that more than anything else. Now, you have to realize something, though, and this is, I don't want to call this a caveat, but I want you to be aware of something. If I were a liberal, I'd call this a caveat. But being a constitutionalist, being a Republican with a small r, I call this an insight, because I don't think it takes away at all from the founding and what they did and how they did it. At the time of the founding, the pulpit was a place to preach patriotism. At the time of the founding, preachers would preach how tyranny was antichrist, how liberty was the state of believers, and all of this stuff, and how God wanted us to be free. Christ died to secure our liberty. Nowadays, we don't see that a lot, because if you want to keep your tax-exempt status, you can't be preaching stuff like that. But at the time of the founding, that wasn't that way. Plus, you had men who, every one of the men, if you ever have those pictures of the signing of the Constitution and the signing of the Declaration, first of all, every man in those paintings was homeschooled. Every single one was homeschooled. Secondly, every single one of them was raised on the Bible. Every one of them. Now, I'm not saying that they were all equally committed and zealous believers. That would be a lie. They weren't. Just like any group we have today, we're not all equally zealous. We don't all equally believe the same way, right? But they did believe that one's faith was important and was inextricable from one's politics, right? So you find, yes, among the founding generation, the most often quoted man is Paul, St. Paul from the Bible. That's without, nobody comes close. I mean, after him, it drops off, but, and now an interesting thing, and I didn't put this in, I might have put it in the introduction to the book, but something I don't normally talk about, since Arthur, I know him to be a, powerful and committed believer, is prior to the end of the War of Independence, the most often quoted book was Deuteronomy. Now think about that. People who know the Bible, I challenge y'all to go, take your Bible out tonight, open Deuteronomy, and say to yourselves, why in the years leading up to the War for Independence, why would the Founding Fathers have been so often quoting Deuteronomy? That's a good little challenge, good homework assignment, Arthur.
Is that part of the reason why when a president swore into office, they used to swear in an oath on an open Bible, turn to Deuteronomy, and it was the blessings and cursings of a nation that follows God and does not follow God? Does that have anything to do with it?
Well, in a way, I mean, it's not official, but George Washington set the tone, and he was a man who knew, and in his personal writings, he said, whatever I do, he was smart. He was a humble man, but he knew that whatever he did was going to set a precedent, because he was the first president under the new Constitution, and so that was him. He wanted to have it open to that, so that as a reminder. And now it is an interesting thing, though, that maybe you don't know, maybe you do. But you know how in court, and I don't know if they still do it in South Carolina, they do in Tennessee, when the judge walks in, the bailiff will say, oyez, 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 which is, Latin for hear, 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 like hear, like ear. Well, now a lot of people think That oye, oye, oye means hear the judgment. Here comes the judge. Hear what he's about to say. That isn't true. The bailiff, in the United States, the bailiff used to walk in with the Bible open and say oye, 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 meaning hear ye the word of God. Now, we don't say that anymore because, again, we, are not allowed to do that. But that's a little insight into even how the court used to recognize the supremacy of the Word of God in this country.
Indeed.
So, St. Paul is the most often quoted, and like I said before. Now, I'm going to give you the top 10, and we can talk about this. You run the show or whatever you want to do.
Well, who's the next one besides St. Paul?
All right, that's William Blackstone.
William Blackstone.
Yes, sir.
All right. What did Sir William? He said a lot. I quote him a good bit.
He is. Yep. He's very. I don't want to say prolific writer because that makes it sound like he wrote a lot of books. He really didn't. He wrote a whole lot in one book, and it was commentaries on the laws of England. Basically, he took it upon himself to explain the laws of England, the traditional laws of England, to explain it, explain what it meant, where it came from, why it was important. He opened his book, of course, talking about property, which, all the founding fathers, if we don't have the right to own property and dictate what happens on our own property, then it's impossible to support self-government. But Blackstone, one of the things he wrote that I love, he says, free men have arms, slaves do not.
Wow.
Right, and he goes on to explain what he means by that, although I would venture to guess that he didn't need to explain free men have arms, slaves do not. If you're government, and another homework assignment, look up St. George Tucker, a forgotten founding father, who wrote, if you can believe it, he doubles down. He writes commentaries on commentaries. So St. George Tucker, one of the forgotten founding fathers, he wrote commentaries on Blackstone's commentaries, kind of fitting it into an American, taking away from a monarchical context to an American context. And he said, using this statement from Blackstone, free men have arms and slaves do not. St. George Tucker wrote, if your government tries to restrict in any way your right to keep and bear arms, then it is, if your liberty is not already lost, it's getting very close to it. And that the government intends to enslave any people whose right to keep and bear arms they infringe on whatsoever. And I mean, you can see that this attitude was shared among our founding fathers. There's no way that any of them would have consented to a waiting period or a permit to exercise what to them was a God-given right of self-defense.
Indeed.
Like I say, Blackstone, mostly commentaries on laws of England. Founding fathers loved that guy, obviously, trying to see, what year was he? Died in 1780, for those of you keeping score at home. Next up, you want to talk about this guy?
Yeah, talk about it.
All right, man. So this is an Italian young man, 26 years old, Cesare Beccaria. Now, I'll tell you, I imagine that within a 10-mile radius of Arthur's house here, Arthur and I are the only two people that have heard of this guy. He was an Italian young man at 26, wrote what he called an essay. You and I would call it a book, but he called it an essay, and it was called On Crimes and Punishments. And he just, he thought, if you come together in a society, how do you determine what's against the law? What's a crime? How do we determine that as a society? How are we going to say it's against the law to do X? How do we determine what's against the law? And then once we as a society have come together and agreed on what we are going to consider to be a crime, how are we going to punish those crimes? How do we determine what is a just and fitting punishment for this list of crimes we've created, right? That was his whole point. Now, this book that he wrote was, I mean, what Jefferson called, or Franklin called it, the best book ever written on the subject of crime and punishment. Jefferson took the book and used it to create Virginia's penal code, and then they ported that to Kentucky when Kentucky became a state. And all the founding fathers, boy, I mean, you look him up, they love this guy. And you can't help it. You start reading his book. One of my favorite things he says, it's not in Founder's Recipe, but I love that he says, I think if a tyrant read my book, I would be executed.
Ooh.
But I'm not afraid because tyrants never read. And I love that quotation because that's true, right? So, quote this, let me get this Beccaria quotation out here. This is, again, from On Crimes and Punishments. He says, well, you know what, I'll give you the short version because it's a really long quotation. I don't want y'all to get bogged down in it. But basically, he says, if you have a law, that law, and the law's purpose is to disarm the citizens, that law is going to end up only affecting people who were never disposed to commit the crime that the disarmament law was meant to prevent. He said, in fact, it not only does it not stop murder, it encourages murder. Because he said, people who are fine with murder, which is he calls the most sacred law, they're going to have no problem breaking a much lower law like don't go within a half a mile of a school with a gun. That law, they're not even going to think about it because they've already determined to break the highest law, thou shalt not kill. So he's like, when you make disarmament laws, you encourage the assailant and you make his situation better and the situation of the assaulted worse, because he says it requires less courage to attack unarmed than armed persons, which makes so much sense. You know, why would there be a school shooting? Well, because we know that there aren't going to be any guns in that gun-free zone. Why would we go into a state? Now, like my homes, I don't know about y'all here. Do you have constitutional carry here?
We passed the constitutional carry law. It's pretty good. It's not constitutional carry. If it was true constitutional carry, we wouldn't need a law saying it was constitutional carry.
That's true.
It's pretty good though.
Yes.
Pretty well open carry.
Yeah. So we have that, and you walk in, and I'm never worried when I walk in my little town, Ace Hardware. We don't have like Home Depot or anything, but you walk in Ace Hardware, I guarantee you could throw a rock and hit 10 guys who have a sidearm. I'm not ever worried about being assaulted in the Ace Hardware, right? But you go into Memphis, and that's the murder capital of the world.
Yeah.
Now, if you go down to certain neighborhoods in Memphis, and you see these guys have automatic weapons, you're going to ask them for their federal firearms license? You're gonna walk out looking like Swiss cheese, my man. And that's the point that Beccaria, this young man, Cesare Beccaria, that's the point he was making. He's like, you disarm. You're never going to disarm a criminal because by definition, criminals do not obey the law. And all you're going to do is you are going to expose good people to attack by, as he would say, less courageous, because, in other words, cowardly people who not only disregard the law regarding, the biblical law, but also would disregard any lesser law. So that's why you go in my Ace Hardware, I guarantee there's never going to be a shooting, a violent act of shooting in there. But you go to Memphis and every day, right? Because of what this man said. Because of the principles that he explained. And Jefferson and Washington and Madison and they all love this guy so much. You have to keep me on time, man. I don't do
Keep
good.
Keep going. We good.
All right. So I was trying to see. I want to remember how old he was. I forget how. So 1738, he was born. So yeah, 26 when he wrote the book.
So all these guys, 26,
Yeah,
really,
yeah.
for our age, young. Imagine a 26-year-old writing a book today People be like, hey, what does he know?
Yeah, he doesn't know anything. Yeah. And so he's considered the father of criminal law. Well, he was when everybody knew who he was. Next up, and these are my second favorites, because these boys, John Trenchard and Thomas Gordon, straight, just blow torches of liberty, man. They wrote 1720 to 1723-ish, and they wrote every Friday. They wrote a letter to the editor of a London newspaper, and they signed it Cato, right? So that's why it's called Cato's Letters, because they signed anonymously Cato, but people knew who it was. It was John Trenchard and Thomas Gordon, and they wrote these letters for about 3 years, pretty much every Friday, and each one is given a new topic. How you can tell a tyrant, why people who aren't virtuous can't be free, why freedom of the press is so important, why freedom of speech is so important, our obligation to maintain pure religion, etc., etc. And if you go and you Google Cato's Letters, the first link there is going to be Online Library of Liberty. Just do yourselves a solid. Just look at the table of contents. Pick out one that looks interesting, because you're going to go away feeling fired up. I've taught these books, Cato's Letters, for 20 years, and I'm going to tell you, they quickly become everybody's favorite, because they do not pull punches, which today most commentators won't step over that line. Trenchard and Gordon do not know a line. And so they have, like, one of their letters is about, it's called On Heroes. And then they go to describe what's a real hero, what's a mock hero. And they say a mock hero is a leader who sends other people's children to die in foreign wars, and he stays way away from it and takes the glory while they take the death. And so he calls that, and he says, but you know what I think we ought to do, says Trenchard and Gordon. They say, we ought to take all these politicians that love getting involved in foreign wars, and we ought to take them and put them in a building, they say, and stock the building with all their favorite weapons that they love to give to poor kids before they send them overseas. Pack this building, fill with their favorite, and let them just kill each other until the last one is dead.
Wow.
I mean, it's really like Hunger Games, like congressional Hunger Games.
Congressional Hunger Games.
And that's why I love them. And one of the things they're very much about freedom of speech. They have several letters in their 4 volumes that are about the freedom of speech. So one of the quotations I have here that I use in the presentation is, wherever truth is dangerous, liberty is precarious. Now, to me, that's self-explanatory. If your government prevents you from telling the truth, then your government is also preventing you from exercising your liberty. And going back to Galatians 4:31, where we are born free and Christ vouchsafed our liberty for us, and then to have government take it. And this is something that people don't realize, because we're not our Father's children. Our founding fathers took it very seriously. The 10 Commandments, for example. They believed that those were, you would be rewarded or punished according to your valiance. And they believed when it said, thou shalt have no other gods before me. And now listen to how they made this connection. Particularly, one of the best who explains it of our founding fathers is Samuel Adams. And I mean, he writes this in his senior thesis at Harvard. Samuel Adams writes about how tyrants want to force you to do anything. And sometimes they want to force you to do something good. Right? Sometimes taking care of your neighbor is a good thing. But not if you're forced to do it, because then it's not charity.
Right.
Right? It's communism. It's redistribution of wealth. So Samuel Adams, and we're talking in the 1760s, he says, look at it this way. God Almighty does not force me to obey his commandments. However, a tyrant does force me to obey his laws. So if I obey a tyrant, I'm obeying a man who is granting unto himself, and thus I am granting unto him, authority that even the Almighty doesn't exercise. So what I'm doing is I'm worshiping somebody above God, because I'm being forced to do good when even God himself doesn't force me to do good. And they took that very seriously. And so Trenchard and Gordon, and this, like I say, now I'll tell you, Forrest McDonald, a famous historian, one of the most famous American historians, said, had there been no Cato's letters, because they were reprinted in every colonial newspaper from Savannah to Boston.
Oh, wow.
Every one of them. Go look. Every one of them reprinted Cato's letters. Now, they reprinted them several years afterward, but they reprinted them when, and our founding fathers were 9, 10, 11 years old reading this stuff. And Forrest McDonald says, had there been no Cato's letter, there would have been no American Revolution.
Nice.
And, and Forrest McDonald is kind of a big deal. Clinton Rossiter, who is, I don't think you'd call him a staunch conservative historian, kind of middle of the road, he'd probably call himself. Even he said Cato's letters is what we would call the dress rehearsal for the revolution. It's because of them as young men reading Cato's letters that when they became of age, they were ready to fight for liberty as ferociously as they did.
Nice.
Yeah, so Trenchard and Gordon, they're my boys there.
Well, that sounds like a pretty good place to cut off here and continue in a part 2. Thank you for viewing this in. We're going to be continuing with a part 2 of those folks that nobody hears about, that have been scrubbed from the history books and, quite frankly, scrubbed from education. And so thanks for joining us on the Gentleman's Review, bringing you the news that the mainstream propaganda does not. And remember to like, share, and subscribe. Thank you.